So it's my pleasure to welcome and to introduce the first plenary lecture or speaker of today, Professor François Raffoul, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and French Studies at Louisiana State University in the USA. And for everybody who's working on the topic of the event, Professor Raffoul does not need an introduction, but I will nevertheless provide one. Professor Raffoul specializes in contemporary continental philosophy, has published extensively on authors such as Heidegger, Nancy, Derrida, Lévinas, Lacan, and many others, and also been a prolific translator of important French texts, opening them up to the English-speaking community. And in his own research, he focused first on continental theories of subjectivity, with special attention to its ethical dimension, exploring the question of responsibility. And this research lies at the basis of his study, The Origin of Responsibility, published at Indiana University Press in 2010. And of course, especially for the conference of this week, it's important that he has researched the question and the conception of the event in contemporary continental thought. And the results of this research were published in 2020, also at Indiana University Press, entitled Thinking the Event. And today, Professor Raffoul's presentation is also entitled Thinking the Event. We are very happy that you are here with us, and we're looking forward to what you have to share with us on the notion of the event. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this very nice introduction. Thank you, Miklos, for the kind invitation. And let me proceed now. So I would like today, in fairly broad strokes, to identify several features of the event, which I explored in my book, Thinking the Event. In that work, I attempted a philosophical inquiry into what constitutes an event as an event, its very eventfulness. Not what happens, not why it happens, but that it happens, and what happening means. By the expression of thinking the event, I do not mean the appropriation by thought of the event under the authority of the principle of reason. Thinking the event means to give thought to its very eventfulness, its sheer happening, which, as suggests, necessarily exceeds both reason and subjectivity. Indeed, one could say that the event, in its disruptive and unpredictable happening, exceeds both the concept and the anticipation of a subject. Such a thought goes against the tradition that has always attempted to neutralize the event by anchoring it in a reason or a cause. Indeed, the concept of event has traditionally been understood and neutralized within a metaphysics of causality, subjectivity, and reason, and in a word, subjected to the demands of rational thought. In all instances, the event is supposed to answer to the demands of the principle of sufficient reason, which states that no event happens without a cause or a reason. In the words of Leibniz, the great principle of natural philosophy and key metaphysical principle of truth is the principle of sufficient reason, he says, namely that nothing happens without a reason why it should be so, rather than otherwise. However, as Heidegger demonstrated in his 1955-1956 lecture course, The Principle of Reason, the principle of reason self-deconstructs, because it cannot apply to itself its own requirements without undermining itself. If the principle of reason states that everything that happens must have a reason, then what is the reason for the principle of reason? Does the principle of reason have a reason? Heidegger says, nothing is without reason, says the principle of reason, nothing, which means not even this principle of reason, certainly it least of all. In short, he continues, it means that the principle of reason is without reason. Said still more clearly, nothing without reason, this which is something is without reason. Unquote. The aporia then reads as follows. Reason has no reason, is without reason. Or put it differently, the ground, since Heidegger writes the Grund, the ground as ground is without ground. Heidegger revealed this self-deconstructive aspect of the principle of reason by following the logic of the question why. Quote, whenever we pursue the ground reason, Grund, of a being, we ask why. Cognition stalks this imperative word from one reason to another. The why allows no rest, offers no stop, gives no support. Unquote. The question why, seeking a foundation, in fact reveals an abyss, betraying that reason itself may lack a rational basis, and that the Grund is indeed Abgrund. One can see here how the principle of reason is cut in a circle. What is the reason of the principle of reason? What is the foundation of a foundation? The ground of a ground that throws it into an abyss, into the abyss of its own impossible foundation. This led Derrida to ask the following questions about reason. Quote, the honor of reason, is that reason? Is honor reasonable or rational through and through? The very form of the question can be applied analogically to everything that evaluates, affirms, or prescribes reason. To prefer reason, is that rational? Or, and this is something else, reasonable? The value of reason, the desire for reason, the dignity of reason, are these rational? Do these have to do wholly with reason? End quote. Is reason rational? Is the principle of reason rational? Does reason have a reason? These questions reveal the aporia harbored in the principle of reason. The principle of reason then collapses or runs aground at the very place of its impossible foundation, there where, as Derrida puts it in Rose, the Grund opens up onto the Abgrund, where giving reasons and giving an account are threatened by or drawn into the abyss, unquote. In fact, for Derrida, the event as such constitutes a challenge to reason and understanding. This is how he puts it. Quote, the event is what comes, happens, and in coming, happening, comes to surprise me, to surprise and to suspend comprehension. The event is first of all that which I do not first of all comprehend. Better, the event is first of all that I do not comprehend. The fact that I do not comprehend my incomprehension, end quote. This may or may not go against what Gert emphasis on connecting event and sense, as we heard on Monday. Maybe we can discuss it later. But you can see here has how the event is connected to a certain limit to sense, if not to nonsense. In any case, the event, as Jean-Luc Marion stated, always suspends the principle of reason. In that sense, the event also comes as an excess in relation to the subject and can only, quote, naturally take by surprise not only the addressee, but also the subject to whom and by whom it is supposed to happen. As Nancy put it, an event is surprising or it is not an event. He says that in an essay on the surprise. The etymology of the term event, from evenire, indicates what comes, a coming that can only come from the future or a to come that necessarily remains unforeseeable, unpredictable, leading Derrida to write that it is an event insofar as what is happening was not predicted. No longer placed under the authority of the principle of sufficient reason, the event must then be rethought as the incalculable and unpredictable arrival of what will always remain other and thus inappropriable for the one to whom it happens. It would then be a matter, in order to give thought to the event in its eventfulness, of freeing the event from the demands of the principle of sufficient reason and from subjectivity, as well as from the predominance of transcendental modes of thought, which claim to provide prior conditions of possibility for the occurrence of events. Indeed, it may well be the case that events are precisely eventful when not pre-organized or prepared by sub-transcendental conditions, or anticipated by a subject, when those events break or pierce the horizon provided by transcendental conditions. The event thus frustrates the principle of reason. The event of an encounter, for instance, is not subject to the principle of sufficient reason. Gilles Deleuze explained, quote, "An encounter is always inexplicable. To think the event is thus to think such absolute inexplicability. No reasons will ever measure up to the happening of the event. As Derrida puts it in The Politics of Friendship, quote, the analysis of conditions of possibility, even existential ones, will never suffice in giving an account of the act or the event. An analysis of that kind will never measure up to what takes place, the effectivity or actuality of what comes to pass. For example, a friendship which will never be reduced to the desire of the potentiality of friendship," end quote. In the end, as Deleuze wrote, quote, "We cannot give the reason for an event," end quote. Thus, the event happens without a reason, or perhaps better said, outside reason. In a 1946 essay, What is Existential Philosophy?, Hannah Arendt makes the radical claim that the event of existence happens outside of thought. Event and thought are heterogeneous. The event is extra-conceptual. The event is outside the concept, a concept which is now placed in relation to an outside that will always remain inappropriable for it. And Deleuze, in fact, also stressed that it is a matter of affirming the relation of exteriority between thought and what it thinks. What appears here is a radical exteriority of the event to thought, which therefore places thought in a state of shock, the shock of the event. Thought does not begin from itself, but is the traumatized response to an event. In fact, events are always traumatic. Derrida writes that an event is traumatic or it is not an event. Quote, "What is a traumatic event? First of all, any event worthy of this name, even if it is a happy event, has within it something that is traumatizing. An event always inflicts a wound in the everyday course of history, in the ordinary repetition and anticipation of all experience," end quote. Now, the notion that philosophy is born out of an event that it does not control is a shock to reason in its quest for ultimate foundations. Hannah Arendt, in that essay, evokes the philosophical shock, the very shock or wonder, Thomas saying, that is at the origin of thinking and philosophy. She writes that events provoke thought and drive us to philosophize, not because they can be thought, but precisely because they cannot. And Hannah Arendt indeed speaks of the essential failure of thought, the failure to appropriate an event within thought. Quote, "Philosophical thought can never get around the fact that reality cannot be resolved into what can be thought. Reason tries to give an account of the event, but precisely it fails. It fails because the event happens outside of thought and remains irreducible to it. It is as if philosophy became the thought of its own impossibility, a thought of the aporia. What it has to think cannot be resolved into thought. So to think the event means, in fact, not to be able to think it. The very purpose of philosophical thought," concludes Arendt, "is not to reduce the event to thought, but instead, quote, to heighten the intellectually irresolvable," end quote. So the event is therefore, I would say, aporetic to thought and reason. This aporia is, of course, what Derrida has been writing on extensively when he explains that the experience of an event is an experience of the aporia, or the impossible. or as he calls it sometimes, the madness of the impossible. In what was to be his last appearance on television in June 2004, on French television, answering the question of the journalist who had asked him what deconstruction is, Derrida replied the following. Deconstruction is what happens. La déconstruction, c'est ce qui arrive. And then he added, that is to say, the impossible. And then he continued and he said the following. The impossible, in fact, he says, is the only thing that happens. La seule chose qui arrive. For Derrida, then, the event will always be on the side of what he calls the impossible. If one understands what he means by impossible, not what cannot be, but what does happen in excess of the possible, not simply what is not possible, but in fact the very resource of the possible, what possibilizes the possible. He writes, we should speak here of an impossible that is not merely impossible, that is not merely the opposite of possible, that is also the condition or chance of the possible, an impossible that is the very experience of the possible. And he also stressed that if all that arises is already possible, and so capable of being anticipated and expected, that is not an event. The event is possible only coming from the impossible. Therefore, only the impossible, as he said, happens. The event happens outside reason, as we saw, and is thus a fact, an absolute fact. As Heidegger stated, and we heard that on Monday on the lecture from Gert, the rose is without wise, it blooms because it blooms, the principle of reason. For Heidegger, that tautology from saying nothing says everything. That is, the entire eventful facticity of the being. It happens because or as, while it happens. The rose blooms because it blooms. The because supersedes the why. The event is thus an absolute fact, Nancy posing in recalling Heidegger's principle of reason that neither reason nor ground sustains the world. The world, he says, in his book, The Creation of the World, is not grounded on any principle. It is a fact. It is only a fact, not founded in reason or in God, but the fact of a mystery, the mystery of an accidental, errant, or wandering existence. He continues by saying that the world is neither necessary nor contingent, if contingency is defined in relation to necessity. Rather, Nancy says, it is beyond or before necessity and contingency as an absolute fact. The event is thus without reason and is to itself its entire possible reason. With the coughing. Another conception of the event is called for happening without ground and, for instance, no longer anchored in a cause substrate. With respect to causality, instead of the event following the cause, we suggest, following Romano and Marion, that the event is the original phenomenon. Events do not simply follow predetermined sequences. An event worthy of the name represents the surge of the new through which precisely it does not follow from a previous cause. A new understanding of temporality is here required. Not a ruled sequence coming from the past to the present, but an eventful temporality coming from the future, disrupting the causal networks and transforming the entire complex of temporality, and indeed transforming the past itself. Nietzsche describes an inversion of temporality in the process of an a posteriori imputation of a cause. Only once the cause has been introduced after the event, then, it is said to exist prior to the event, an event that has now been transformed into necessity and meaning. A meaning that we have introduced. So the meaning of the event, the sense, is injected, according to Nietzsche, after the fact of the event, which at first doesn't have one. The event has been reconstructed and is now said to be happening according to causality. In fact, one must invert the inversion and posit that the event happens before the cause. That something happens is the original fact. In that sense, there is nothing before the event. This is why an event could not be explained by prior events, because its occurrence has transformed the concept by introducing a new one. Jean-Luc Marion writes, inasmuch as it is a given phenomenon, the event does not have an adequate cause and cannot have one. Only in this way can it advance on the wings of a dove, unforeseen, unusual, unexpected, unheard of, and unseen. End quote. Marion thus speaks of the character and the dignity of an event. That is an event or a phenomenon that is unforeseeable, not exhaustively comprehensible, not reproducible. In short, absolute, unique, happening. And he says, in conclusion of that passage, we will therefore call it a pure event. End quote. Next point, one of the constitutive errors in the metaphysical tradition's reliance on causality is the imposition of causes on every existence, on every event, as their substratum. Causality is the alleged substrate of the event. Nietzsche says, being is thought into things everywhere as a cause is imputed to things. The belief in causality also involves the belief in the subject. As Nietzsche writes, a doer or a subject was imputed to everything that happened. Yet Nietzsche insists, quote, that there is no being behind doing, affecting, becoming, and that the doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The notion of an underlying subjectivity is contrary to the facts, an unphenomenological construction. For Nietzsche, in fact, the subject is a linguistic construct. Metaphysical idols are nothing for him but grammatical structures. He writes, in Beyond Good and Evil, formerly one believed in the soul as one believed in grammar and the grammatical subject. The difference between a doer and the deed, the position of an agent or subject beneath the event, is made possible by what he calls a seduction of language that distinguishes an agent from its deed. But for Nietzsche, there is no doer, there is only the deed. Now, this reveals the radical impersonality of the event, of any event, and I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing that. It happens of itself. Even when it comes to the self, this impersonality prevails. For, as Heidegger stressed, for instance, I do not give or posit myself, but I am thrown into myself from an impersonal, and I should add opaque, event. No one is doing the throwing. It simply happens. The I, too, in its very ipseity, one could say is happening as an impersonal phenomenon, since it does not posit itself. It's just happening. At the very least, we could say that the I is bordered by two impersonal poles, birth and death. Birth, as the I arises out of an impersonal process, and Marion reminds us of this impersonality of birth in Negative Certainties, writing, quote, that my birth, the event from which I come and that gives me to myself, the event that concerns no one as much as me alone, and that remains inaccessible to anyone, this event nevertheless occurred essentially without me, end quote. So we can see how the I emerges out of the impersonal. And death, of course, where the I becomes a non-person. The I is thus given to itself from an impersonal event. It happens. Now let us be careful not to substantify this it, in such expression, it happens, as if it designated some substrate or some entity distinct from the happening. We saw that the event rests on no substrate, has no author. This is why it is impersonal. It happens. What of this it? Reflecting in the lecture on Time and Being, 1962, on the impersonality of the expression es gibt, it gives, there is, Heidegger notes that the risk when discussing the it is to posit some indeterminate power that somehow would cause the event. Again, as we saw with Nietzsche, Heidegger states that the problem might reside in the very structure of language, in a certain grammar that divides subject and predicate, and that determines the it as a separate entity with an efficiency of its own, leading to the belief in a metaphysical substrate. And we saw how Nietzsche stated that metaphysics emerges out of the predominance of a certain grammar, or I should say a certain belief in grammar. We recall here his famous saying in Twilight of the Idol, quote, "I am afraid we are not getting rid of God because we still believe in grammar," end quote. As such, this grammatical structure neutralizes the eventfulness of the event. It is a matter of no longer isolating the it from the happening of the event. The it does not refer to a subject existing under the event of being, but is coextensive with such event. If I say it rains, the it designates the raining itself, the event of raining. The it does not designate a separate underlying substrate, but designates the impersonal eventfulness of the event itself. The it is a stand-in for no one. And in Heidegger's work, the event of being is always an impersonal phenomenon. There is es gibt. Now, a word on Heidegger's contribution to the thinking of the event. As you recall, this issue came up yesterday with Claude Romano's lecture. And I'm taking a little bit of a diverging view than Claude Romano on this point. I claim, or make the claim, that Heidegger develops an important thought of the event in the following sense. He approaches being itself as eventfulness and temporal happening, or as he often says, as the very event of presence. Heidegger's contribution is to show that being is not a substance, that precisely never happens and only remains the same as constant presence, but an event lacking any prior support or substrate. Returning from beings to being, from the present entity to presence itself, and even to presencing and Wesen, Heidegger's thought determines itself as a thinking of the event. This emphasis on the event of being, as opposed to the substantialization of beings in the tradition, was pursued by Heidegger in the entirety of his work, undertaking a critique of atemporal ontology as an attempt to grasp the temporal happening of being. As Emmanuel Levinas recognized, the fundamental contribution of Heidegger's thought is to have grasped being no longer as a noun or as a substantive, but in its verbality and its eventfulness. Levinas explained, quote, "The most extraordinary thing that Heidegger brings us is a new sonority of the verb to be, precisely its verbal sonority. To be, not what is, but the verb, the act of being. This contribution is what is unforgettable in the work of Heidegger," end quote. In Being and Time, the decisive break with the inadequate ontology of substantiality and the opening to a thinking of the event occurred in the distinction between the categories of existence, or existentials, with the categories pertaining to presence at hand, Vorhandenheit. Existence is an event approached as an openness and as a possibility, as a to be, a Zusein. To that extent, I contend that we could say that all of Dasein's existentials must be approached in an eventual sense. They are not substantial categories, but existentials, that is, ways to be. They are eventful, they are to be engaged as event. Because Dasein as a whole is defined as possibility and not given as present at hand or vorhanden. Therefore, distinguishing being from beings has allowed Heidegger to consider being as an event. And again, this is the import of the ontological difference, as Levinas, once again, explains very clearly. Quote, "The radical distinction between being and beings, the famous ontological difference, there is a radical difference between the verbal resonance of the word being and its resonance as a noun. It is the difference par excellence, it is difference." So for Heidegger, being itself is not an entity, a substance, but an event of presence, which he thematized later under his later thinking of Erasmus. As we saw yesterday, he says we should not translate Erasmus as event, but that he meant not as an ontical occurrence, which doesn't mean it doesn't have its proper ontological eventfulness, as the giving of presence. To that extent, the event of being is properly invisible, not a present thing, but a pure happening. It belongs to what Heidegger called, in a late seminar, a phenomenology of the inapparent. Let me move on beyond Heidegger a little bit. And I'm going to try to develop the idea of the performative and the notion of the letting in the thinking of the event. The event is, as we saw, a radically impersonal phenomenon. It is enacted by no one, no subject, no self. We could then perhaps say that the event occurs outside the subject. Derrida writes that an event, quote, is something that happens in some sense without or before any subject, without or before anyone's decision, end quote. The event exceeds the capacity of a subject, the power of a self. This is why Derrida, although the two notions seem convergent, will ultimately reject the concept of the performative to think the event, as the performative still relies too heavily for him on the action and the power of a subject. He writes, we traditionally say that the performative produces events. I do what I say. I open the session if I am presiding over it. I produce the event of which I speak. In general, we thus relate the possibility of the event that is produced to a performative initiative and thus to a performative responsibility, end quote. However, in such performative, in fact, the event is neutralized by the very position of a powerful subject. Quote, a performative produces an event only by securing for itself, in the first person singular or plural, in the present, and with the guarantee offered by conventions or legitimated fictions, it secures then the power that in ipseity gives itself to produce the event of which he speaks. So Derrida has an issue with the performative because it's the institution of a power which will prove antinomical to the event. Just as so-called constative or theoretical language, ultimately for Derrida, the performative also misses what is eventful in the event. Quote, now, just like the constative, it seems to me, he writes, the performative cannot avoid neutralizing, indeed canceling, the eventfulness of the event it is supposed to produce. And again, in fact, one does not produce an event. And they always make fun. Mario makes fun as well Derrida of the event organizers, because you cannot produce or organize an event. Certainly, Derrida concedes something does happen with a performative, but what is eventful exceeds it. Quote, I'm not saying that nothing then happens, but what happens is programmable, foreseeable, controlled, conditioned by conventions. Therefore, he says, it can thus be said, I would dare say, that an event worthy of its name is an event that derails all performativity, end quote. This means that it is a matter of thinking the event outside of a problematics of power, beyond, as he says, all performative mastery, beyond all power, as the event undoes both will and power. The experience of the event, writes Derrida, defeats my will. The event deconstructs both subjectivity and power. And with this deconstruction of power, it is the space of ethics which is here opened. I will return to it shortly. This is why when it comes to the event, it will not be a matter of doing, which involves a will and a subject, but rather of letting. Derrida explains that when it comes to the event, it is a matter of abandoning the will and letting the event happen, as opposed to making it happen. A making happen that always mobilizes the power and the will of a subject. Derrida writes, must there not be an absence of the will to abandon, whence the question of letting happen rather than making happen? Indeed, once the event is no longer referred to the demands of the principle of reason, no longer anchored in a subject cause, it becomes possible to let it give itself in its eventfulness and in the way it happens each time. Thinking the event would here mean not subjecting it to reason, but letting it be, letting it happen. And thinking here should be understood as a kind of letting itself, a letting, or as Heidegger called it, Gelassenheit, a letting be, releasement. So thinking the event would mean here letting the event happen of itself, an event which itself is a kind of letting. It lets itself happen. Indeed, for Heidegger, letting, as he puts it in a late seminar, letting is, quote, the deepest meaning of being, end quote. So when being gives itself, it lets itself. An event happens of itself. So an event is never prepared, produced, or made, but let be. To the letting of being corresponds the fundamental disposition of thinking as letting, Gelassenheit, letting be. So thinking the event would mean here letting the letting be. Now, let me say a word about the notion of subjectivity. As the event happens of itself, as we saw, it undoes the power of a constituting subject, placing us, as it were, no longer in the position of actors, no longer as constituting, but as constituted, which Marion calls the witness. The event happens of itself, or as Marion puts it, it passes. It passes and passes of itself. The French is il passe, meaning it passes, et se passe, literally passes of itself, but se passer means in French to happen. So it passes and happens, or it passes and passes of itself, or happens of itself. Marion writing, what is proper to the event by definition is not to be insofar as it subsists in permanence, but insofar as it passes. Let us stress here the key importance of the motif of passing, passer, in the thinking of the event. The event is not a present being, for instance, but essentially passes. It does not remain and consist as a thing or an object, even less. No, the event belongs to the fundamental category of passing, not being in the sense of a substantial presence, but passing. In Negative Certainties, Marion cites a poem from Baudelaire, À une passante, translated as to a passerby or to a woman passing by, or in passing, which reads as follows. Around me roared the nearly deafening street. Tall, slim in mourning, in majestic grief, a woman passed. Longue, mince, en grand deuil, douleur majestueuse, une femme passa. On such passing, Marion then adds the following. What happens, even if I can expect it, arrives without my being able to expect it at a precise moment. The event arrives, or rather it happens to me, il m'arrive, by surprising me all of a sudden, unexpectedly. End quote. Such an event, he continues, affects me more than I am able to constitute it. It begins before me, arrives without me, anticipating my expectation, and disappears from sight. This passing becomes the paradigm of the event. The event, he continues in negative certainties, quote, only happens to the extent that she, this woman, passes and thus disappears without subsisting, enduring, or persisting. Only an object can persist in presence. However, the event, Marion continues, gives itself only in abandoning me, unquote. The event passes of itself, surpass, happens, while exceeding us from all sides. This passing passes us by, expropriates us. Marion writes, the phenomenon of the passing reached me, and so to speak, constituted me as not constituting it, to the point that all I have is recognize myself as the mere witness, the one who certainly saw what he has seen, but does not understand what he has seen. So again, the idea of nonsense, or absence of sense that Derrida mentioned, and then we talked about at the beginning. And he continues, I renounce my claim to be its transcendental subject. Hence, in Waterloo, Marion writes, the battle passes and passes away on its own without anybody making it or deciding it. It passes and each watches it pass, fade into the distance, and then disappear like it had come, that is to say, of itself. We, as subject of the event, are also passing and bypassed or expropriated in the passing of the event. Let me, in my last section, or concluding section, let me focus on this idea of an ethics of the event that I mentioned earlier, the idea of letting and openness as opposed to power and will and mastery through the principle of reason, through the demand of reason. It has been an issue, as we saw, as Derrida puts it, of freeing the pure eventfulness of the event from traditional attempts to neutralize it, whether through the demands of a principle of reason or through the position of a willful ego. The alternative between power and openness towards the event opened the space of an ethics of the event, in which, in opposition to the attempts at mastery, it is a matter of being hospitable to the event, of letting it come and letting it happen as it happens. Indeed, the ethics of the event, as I approach it here, is to be taken as an ethics of hospitality, as openness to the event, as a welcome of the event in its eruptive coming. The happening of the event is what Derrida calls the coming of an arrivant, an arrival that is welcomed by an original hospitality. So let me focus in closing on this original ethics of the event. Derrida recognized in a 2004 interview with L'Humanité the growing importance that the thinking of the event has taken for him, significantly insisting on its ethical scope. Quote, what you say about a privileged attention to the event is correct. It has become more and more insistent. The event as that which happens, unpredictably, singularly. Not only what happens, but also who or what happens or arrives, the arrivant, the arriving one. The question what is to be done with who or what arrives commands a thinking of hospitality, of the gift, of forgiveness, of the secret of witnessing. Unquote. We see here emerge the thematics of the hospitality to the event, an ethical welcome of the event. Such hospitality, we should note from the outset, is on the side of the arrivant, of the event, who or what comes whenever it comes. It is not I who decides who or what comes. Rather, it is the event that comes and happens to me and that crosses the threshold of one's self or one's home. This is why Derrida rejects the identification between hospitality and invitation. He insists that hospitality is not an invitation, but he calls it instead a visitation. So the event is a visitation. Derrida explains, quote, the absolute arrivant must not merely be an invited guest, someone I'm prepared to welcome, who I have the ability to welcome. I must be someone whose unexpected, it must be someone whose unexpected, unforeseeable arrival, whose visitation, and here I am opposing visitation to invitation, is such an eruption that I am not prepared to receive the person. I must not even be prepared to receive the person for there to be genuine hospitality. Invitation is the expecting of some arrival without surprise. But hospitality, says Derrida, requires absolute surprise. And we recall here what Nancy claimed, that an event is surprising, or else it is not an event. For Derrida, he continues, I must be unprepared or prepared to be unprepared for the unexpected arrival of any other. And he adds the other, like the Messiah, must arrive whenever he or she wants. This indeed becomes the very definition of the event, which Derrida captures in its most limpid simplicity in this passage. And one notes its tautological character. I'll read it in French first. Ce qui arrive, arrive. Translated, what happens, happens. And rendered in the English translation, whatever happens, happens, whoever comes, comes. And that, in the end, Derrida concludes, is the only event worthy of this name. What happens, happens. Hospitality, then, is a receiving or welcoming that has no power over its own welcoming. It is an opening without horizon, that is, without a horizon of expectation. The event is an unforeseeable happening affecting a vulnerable subjectivity. Derrida concluding on this point, if an event worthy of this name is to arrive or happen, it must, beyond all mastery, affect a passivity. It must touch an exposed vulnerability, one without absolute immunity, without indemnity. It must touch this vulnerability in its finitude and in a non-horizontal fashion, there where it is not yet, or is already no longer possible to face or face up to the unforeseeability of the other. It is to this extent that for Derrida, hospitality in the proper sense, in its full sense, must be unconditional. It is unconditional because it arises out of the event and not from some conditions laid out by a subject host. The subject is powerless before the coming of the event as arrivant. Derrida writes, the visitor is someone who could come at any moment without any horizon of expectation, who could, like the Messiah, come by surprise. Anyone could come at any moment, unquote. And hospitality here is an unconditional welcoming of the arrivant. The absolute guest, he writes, is the arrivant for whom there is not even a horizon of expectation, who burst onto my horizon of expectation when I'm not even prepared to receive the one who I'll be receiving. That is hospitality. The arrival of the arrivant will constitute an event, Derrida says, only if I am not capable of receiving him or her. Again, you see here the exceeding of possibility. I am not able to, I'm not capable of. And it is like the event on the side of the impossible. Unconditional hospitality is the welcoming then of such an event. As we stressed, the event is an absolute arrivance. For Derrida says, what is true for the arrivant is equally true for the event, equally true. In other words, he connects here the event with the coming of the other, which as such mobilizes a welcoming gesture. We noted the coming to the fore of the motif of letting in the happening of the event. The letting also affects the welcome of the event. To the letting of being, subjective genitive corresponds, as we saw, the fundamental disposition of thinking, as Gelassenheit or letting be. Ethics here designates such letting a genuine Gelassenheit with respect to the event. This arrival is welcomed in an original hospitality, a welcome of the other in the subjective genitive. We noted throughout this work how the event happens also outside knowledge, in excess of knowledge and reason, and in contradiction with power and will, thereby making room for another type of engagement with the event, namely an ethical engagement. Whereas knowledge, as Levinas claims, is a violence, ethics, understood as unconditional hospitality, lets the event be. Thinking the event then turns to be an ethical engagement with its unpredictable arrival. To recapitulate the various features that I have tried to unveil today, event as access to reason and subjectivity, as suspension of the principle of reason, as preceding the cause, as happening outside of reason, as trauma, as pure fact without ground, as impossible, as impersonal, and yet bringing out of self as subject of and to the event, as letting and as happening to hospitality. Those are some of the threads that I explored and followed in my work on the event. Thank you.
Professor Raffoul, for your... you disappeared.
I'm here.
Okay, you're still there. No, you disappeared for a second from the screen. Sorry. Thank you for your excellent lecture in which you helped us understand all these different aspects of the event, especially in relation to French thought and its Heideggerian heritage. Let's open the floor for discussion. Perhaps I can start with a question. It would be nice if somebody could... The talker is automatically... Okay. Perhaps I can start with a question concerning the last part of your talk, the ethics related to the event and the pure welcoming of the other. One could say that perhaps this welcoming, and you said it also yourself, I think how you described Derrida, I think that's fully accurate, that it has a dimension of impossibility. And then, of course, the question comes up, okay, I'm only a finite human being. So how can I welcome? And it's a type of question, I think, that also is at the heart of Paul Ricoeur's engagement with Levinas. And so he appreciates in Levinas very strongly the appeal of the other, but then he's wondering where is the analysis of the receptivity on the side of the human. And I think that sometimes I think that Derrida triggers the same type of question. So one of these quotations there, or these words that he's using, tout autre est tout autre. So this beautiful phrase, every other is every bit other. But if you really take that seriously, because of all these claims on me, I, as a finite being, I cannot respond. I mean, it just shuts me down, so to speak. So how would you account for this? Let's call it the receptivity on the side of the human for this otherness.
Well, I mean, if we follow Derrida, and not Ricoeur, right, but Derrida, who himself follows Levinas on this point,
yeah,
which Ricoeur actually criticized in a book, a short book on Otherwise Than Being. It was a similar critique on this idea of receptivity. But if you follow Derrida following Levinas, first of all, hospitality, as I mentioned a couple of times today, is on the side of the arrivant, meaning I'm not discussing my preparedness or capacity to welcome. I'm discussing the fact that something showed up unexpectedly to me and traumatized me. And Derrida, I quoted that passage at the end, me not being capable of receiving is what hospitality is, when I'm not capable. So again, this is where the impossible comes in, as you mentioned, right? The fact that he completely deconstructs the idea of the capacity of a self, even a passive self, who would have a receptivity, a capacity to receive. So he's not relying on any capacity. And I think that's where Ricoeur disagreed. Because Ricoeur said, if I remember that book, there must be someone there to receive that event. A self must be constituted. But Derrida, following Levinas, are saying that the self is constituted by that event and does not pre-exist it, if you will, as a sphere of ipseity and power. So it's an aporetic, as you mentioned, tout autre and tout autre is the aporia of the event, right? Of the reception of the other. It's completely aporetic, and Derrida does not shy from it, or does not try to overcome that aporia, right? He stays with it. He just stays with it. So this is just the phenomenon of receptivity of the event. So this is the debate that we can have between Derrida and Levinas against Ricoeur, or Ricoeur against them. And that's what, for Derrida again, hospitality does not come from me. It's not me who lands hospitality. It's something just showed up in my house. Something destabilizes or comes in, and in that motion traumatizes me and constitutes me as traumatized. And then having to, right, manage that arrival. And then a self is indeed instituted. But that self was born from this event, from this traumatizing event.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's convincing, but I think that's what they're going with.
Yeah, that's very helpful, I think. Let me, yes, back and then.
Thank you, Professor Raffoul. My name is Michalis Tegos. We have had the opportunity to discuss in the past also in Derrida conference about this topic. My question is prompted by something you said yesterday to Claude Romano about ontological difference. And today you touched a little bit upon this. About the question of ontical events, if I am correct, something like this. I understand, and please correct me, because to say this question, I need to make a small, perhaps, detour, but please correct me if I have something incorrectly, yes? I understand that already in Heidegger's work, there is this tension, early Heidegger, between the way he conceives ontological difference, between the way he conceives being on the one hand and history or historiality on the other hand. And I think that in the French epigons of Heidegger, like Derrida, for example, this tension is also existent. There is this tension between the event in the ontological sense and the event in a historical sense. So my question is the following.
What do you mean historical? Just clarify.
The way that later Heidegger conceives of historical design appropriating its own being. So my question is the following. Is it not correct that even for Heidegger, the ontological difference is abandoned at some point because it is still bound, as he says, to the metaphysics of presence? And I think that the category of the event begins to be all the more important as he begins to move away from the concept of ontological difference. So my question is it not a trap, and maybe even not a mistake, to reproduce the ontological difference on the level of the event? It's not the same as in to say that there is a difference between the event, with a capital E, ontological, and the events, as in events in history. I don't think it is symmetrical. I remember, for example, the way Heidegger says being with a capital B is not a being. I would say the event is not an event in the terms of historical with a small e.
Yeah.
Or maybe with a formulation that is in later Heidegger, being needs beings in order to reveal itself, yes, but beings do not need being with a capital B. Beings may well be in the abandonment of being. So I think events with a small e could equally be in abandonment of the event. I think there is a tension there, and I am not sure, I'm not convinced that Derrida, Lyotard, even Deleuze have solved this tension. I would like your opinion, and it's a genuine question. I do not have an answer. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a very good question, very complicated point you're making, because you're like questioning the idea of the ontological difference and moving beyond it, right? If I understand you correctly, moving beyond it to think the event and what would that look like, right? Is that where you're going with this idea, with the question?
The event is to play this role of a new beginning for thought.
Yeah.
As late Heidegger and as the French want to understand this conception, this concept, I think it needs to be clarified in terms of the ontological difference.
Okay, well.
If it is to be a new beginning for thought.
Well, let me try to begin addressing your question. I'm not sure if so let's go back to Romano, right? Romano's point, which is in his book, Event and World, and which he repeated yesterday, is that Heidegger dismisses ontical events, right, in being and time, and that therefore nothing can happen to Dasein, and that therefore there's no thinking of the event in Heidegger. I think it's too brutal and too negative a view to say because he brackets the ontic in being and time that there's no event. That's what I tried to say yesterday. He definitely brackets the ontic, and I don't think he brackets the ontical events so much as the ontic itself. In other words, when he dismisses the death of the other, which Romano talked about, it's not the event the issue, it's the fact that we don't have access to the ontological sense of death according to Heidegger if you go through the death of the other. So the point is not to dismiss the event, it's to dismiss the ontic. And the other, the call of conscience, same thing. You cannot presuppose what conscience means if you go through ontical instances of it, because he's trying to reveal the ontological constitution of conscience. And you cannot do that if you get stuck in ontic examples of it. So this is a general method that Heidegger pursues in Being and Time, which is to bracket the ontic in order to write Being and Time as an existential analysis of Dasein. So I already disagree with the idea that, but let's give Romano the point. Let's say, okay, he does bracket ontical events, right? That doesn't mean that there's no thinking of the event. It just means that it happens ontologically. In other words, it's only the ontic that has been bracketed out. Well, what about Dasein itself? Well, as I talk about today, Dasein doesn't have a substantial self, right? It is a series of existentials that are all possibilities of being, but they're not substantial. They're not vorhanden. They are to be enacted. It's totally eventful, completely eventful. My entire being is eventful. I don't have a substance. I have to make myself, I have to become authentic, etc., etc. So I never agreed with this radical, claim that there's no eventfulness in Heidegger. It's just that Heidegger does think it at the ontological level. And that's in the early Heidegger. Now let's go to the later Heidegger a little bit. By the way, the ontological difference, well, I'll say the point in a minute, but I'll give a general statement on the ontological difference in his work. The later Heidegger talks about Eragnis, right? And yesterday Romano says Oh, but he says you cannot translate it as event, right? He said, Heidegger says Ereignis should not be rendered as event. Therefore, Romano concluded it's not about events. But the citations where Heidegger says that, which I have, and it's in my book, I discuss them, is that Ereignis should not be rendered in the sense of an ontical occurrence. Yes, for comist. In other words, it is nothing to do with not an event. It's the fact that we should not confuse Ereignis with, something that happens in the world, like some sort of ontical event, that's an occurrence, right? And he always distinguished them. In other words, Heidegger would always distinguish exception with one text I'm going to tell you about. He distinguishes ontical events from ontological events. Do you agree with that? Well, at least in the majority of his thinking, he always distinguishes being from beings. Well, we can go back to this idea of the difference. When he says Ereignis should not be rendered as an ontical occurrence, he means to say that Ereignis should be understood in terms of being. I'll give you one example. In the lecture on time and being, 1962, you know the lecture, right? Heidegger says, my whole effort, this is 1962, late Heidegger. He says, my whole effort is to think being without beings. So we're back, even worse than being in time, to the ontological difference. Because now there's no beings, it's just pure being. And how does he define Ereignis? As the giving, the es gibt of being, as the es gibt of time. So Ereignis is the event of being. It's not an ontical occurrence, it's the event of presence. So if there is eventfulness in Heidegger, it is on the level of being. So you challenge the idea of ontological difference now, right? And let me give you one example, one counterexample on that. You know the essay, The Thing, in Heidegger, the thing, das Ding. In there, Heidegger says the thing thinks. He gives a verbal sense of thing. The thing is a thinking. There's a thinking of the thing. So there is an authentic ontical eventfulness. Because prior to that, ontical events are inauthentic. But in that essay, The Thing, there is a proper, authentic conception of the thing as eventful. And I think that's a rare occurrence, if I can use that word, in Heidegger, to recognize what you call, I think, a certain overcoming of the ontological difference. Because now being is in the thing. The thing is thinking. And at that point, you're right. The ontological difference may not be there. Because it's problematic in itself, it's problematic. But I have to say, I don't know if you agree or disagree, to me, the thrust of the entirety of his thinking is to make the distinction between being and beings. And only in small moments, like in the Beiträge or in lots of the text, he said we need to overcome it for the reasons you listed. But I don't know. What do you think?
Am I allowed to say 2 words? Thank you very much for your response. I am covered. Only one point, maybe this precisely exception where Heidegger confounds the ontological and the ontical, I would say is one of the most disastrous moments of his entire oeuvre, precisely because it is where he brings the historical event of the Germany of his time, precisely near the texts of the event, close to the ontological moment, close to being a proximity to historical Dasein's destiny. And I think this is the most disastrous moment of Heidegger, precisely because he himself is in a tension between the event in the ontological sense and events in the historical sense. So this is my interpretation.
Okay. Well, we can continue another time. Thank you.
My question concerns the constitution of the subject. I just approached this question with some variations. The first thing you said that, and I completely agree, that Dasein is thoroughly eventful existence. Then this thoroughly eventful self should be related to the event in the sense which exceeds, in principle, the self. So, okay, this is one version. The other version is that this event constitutes subjectivity as a witness. Now, the witness is, as Professor van der Heiden emphasized it, rightly, to my mind, the witness preserves the event. In what sense? This preserving can happen by telling stories. What happened? Stories about what happened.
Yes.
Now, this storytelling is not giving accounts, not reasoning why it happened.
Yes.
So there's a difference here between how to preserve, how to relate to the preserving of the event. Okay, even I could say probably that telling stories about what happened is a rather mythological, historiological way of receiving and preserving the event. And it is another way to trying to give account of it, which is much more rational. So on this point, we are right at Nietzsche, who differentiates the rational from the mythological strongly, and we know how he proceeds. So I'm still not clear on this point. How is the subject constituted? Because as a result of all these, a proper relation to the event, which exceeds us, is that I'm witness of it, I'm telling stories about it, but then we are very close to the notion that we are simply hermeneutical beings with understanding and with a finite understanding, and this understanding is always disturbed and whatever. So is that a right picture, or you understand it?
Yes, it's perfectly right. There is a hermeneutic relationship to the event, of course, you just described it. There is a hermeneutic dimension. I cannot see you anymore. Oh, yeah, the camera is zooming out. So, and the witness has to do with that. But do you remember the passage that I cited of Marion, that the witness does not understand what he saw? So the hermeneutics comes in as an attempt to give sense.
Yes.
As Gerd defined that on Monday, explained that on Monday very well, to the event. But I believe, unless I'm incorrect, that this sense is against the background of an absolute nonsense where we do not understand what happened. We cannot understand what happened because the event happens outside of thought, Hannah Arendt. And the infinite hermeneutics that proceeds comes out of this expropriation where sense cannot make sense of the event. And then we have to spend trying to make sense of the event. So that's where I'm going with this idea of sense and nonsense. And hermeneutics is developing out of this original encounter with nonsense. That's where I was going. Storytelling, witnessing is a negotiation with nonsense. And it's the production of sense, trying to overcome this aporia that, as Marion described it perfectly well, he saw what happened, but he does not understand what he saw. So this is the origin of hermeneutics. The attempt to make sense of it. But it's impossible, if we follow Hannah Arendt, that events occur outside of thought and thought can never appropriate it. That's why she said that thinking fails. And that thinking will never make sense of it. So this is where I was going with it. I'm not saying I'm right, but this is what I was developing with this aporia of nonsense.
Thank you.
So thank you, Professor, for the very thought-provoking lecture. My question is connected with what Professor just asked, and is, so in order to welcome the event or the arrivant as subject or as constitute itself, and to start this process of interpretation or the hermeneutical work you just talked about, should we individuate, so the process that comes after the individuatio, the principium individuationis, should we recognize in a way the event or the arrivant and therefore individuate it not in a metaphysical way in order to start this welcoming process and hermeneutical process? Because if we, like, the event is not an object, so we cannot identify it, recognize it as when we know a certain object. And we are appropriated by it. The self in it is constituted thanks to the event. So how can we start the process of welcoming and so on if we are not able to recognize it in the usual metaphysical way? So how does this individuation, if it's the right term in English, work?
I don't know if that's what you're saying, but are you saying that the event is always singular? Because that's the case, I agree completely. Yes, the event is singular and extra-conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it does not belong to generality or conceptual universality or generality. So yes, from the outset, an event singularizes because it is singular, and the welcome of it is the accounting. I mean, the reception of such singularity. So I totally agree with that. Absolutely. Whether you can conceptualize it later, if you start to think it through concepts, that's another issue, which perhaps you were trying to raise.
But if I'm allowed for a follow-up, I'm not
Yes.
talking about conceptualizing it, but rather
Okay.
which kind of welcoming can we do? Like, can we start without conceptualizing it, without a conceptual form of hermeneutics?
Yeah. Well, the welcoming, as I mentioned, is on the side of the event. It's not on my side. I stress that today, that it is the arrival of the other, or it is the happening of the event that affects me as a passivity, to replant the idea. So the welcoming never comes from me. I'm not doing anything. I'm affected by something. I'm traumatized by it. Why? Because this comes from outside me. Back to the idea of exteriority from Hannah Arendt. So I'm traumatized only because something has happened to me that comes from without me, and therefore puts myself into a crisis and having to accommodate that. So this is what, in other words, the issue is how does one welcome otherness? That's the issue. How does one welcome otherness? Exteriority, otherness. And Derrida put it, it's through trauma. It's the trauma that becomes synonymous with hospitality, with welcome. I have welcomed the other when I've been traumatized. That's how I welcome it. Anyway, that's how I was trying to think it.
Okay, thanks.
From the other, perhaps I can ask, if you allow me, to ask a follow-up question about the nonsense about the nonsense of the event. So
Absolutely.
I think that there are all kinds of events that we can experience as nonsense, but I'm trying to understand what it means if I try to relate to my own birth as nonsense. I can imagine if I start reasoning, that I say, well, the chances that I exist, that I've come into existence given the whole evolutionary path, is exactly zero. So this is a pure accident, purely random. So that's nonsensical. But
Yes.
this nonsensical is a conclusion after a reasoning. But the very fact that I start thinking about it in the first place, that's derived from my very birth. So it's for me very difficult to understand what it means to relate to my own birth, out of which I come into existence, as something nonsensical. I can understand it perhaps with Nancy as a kind of an opening of sense, but nonsense, I find that a very harsh term. And I have no idea how to experience my own birth in any way before I start trying to make sense of it. Because before I can listen, for instance, to the stories of my parents telling me how I was as a very young child or so, I was already alive, experiencing things. And so where is this nonsense of the original event?
It's phenomenological nonsense. It's not coming from a reflection. In other words, what you're describing now is how your thinking led you to the idea of nonsense, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. So that's what I said. So for me, nonsense only comes into play after reasoning.
But the nonsense was already there. That nonsense was phenomenologically there from the get-go. Your thinking simply found it again. You rediscovered it, you articulated it, but you would not have reached it if it wasn't there already, right? You wouldn't have said, well, this is nonsensical, if it was not nonsensical phenomenologically already.
Well, I wonder whether it is nonsensical phenomenologically already. Because as soon as something of my birth appears, it is with sense. Because that's what it means to be there and to be alive.
But that's completely nonsensical that you would be there all of a sudden.
Sorry, what is nonsensical?
That you're there and all of a sudden that here you are. This is nonsensical.
No, it's pure sense, I would say. No, but I mean, it is nonsensical when I start thinking about it. So for me, this idea of nonsense is something that comes up in reasoning. And as soon as we start thinking about the randomness of all the things that happened, if we look at the things, how they evolved according to evolutionary schemes.
So you're saying if you don't think about it, it's perfectly sensible and there's no issue at all?
Well, there is first sense, I would say. There's first orientation. And I'm responding to that because you said that hermeneutics is about giving sense. Now, I think a little bit in terms of Heidegger, zu verstehen geben. Something is given to be understood to us. So we are always secondary to the sense that is given us. So I think that's the hermeneutic. For me, that is the hermeneutic point of view.
But Heidegger says that sense is based on nonsense.
Sorry, Heidegger?
Says that. Heidegger says that sense is based on nonsense.
Yes. But perhaps I'm not Heideggerian there. Yeah.
Okay. There's a quote in Being and Time. There's a quote in Being and Time where he says the following. So after he talked about the world as a meaningful whole, right? He talks about being in the world and he says being at home is less originary than not being at home. In other words, sense rest upon a more originary level of nonsense, which is anxiety in the end for him, right? Anxiety and...
Yes, but that's when we get into touch with the sense of being rather than the sense of beings. And so the falling away of the sense of all beings is the opening up of my own sense as potentiality for being. Yeah.
But what does he mean when he says the not at home is the more originary phenomenon? I understand it as meaning nonsense is the original condition. And sense rest upon nonsense would be my claim. You don't agree with that? You think it's the other way around?
I don't think I agree with that, no.
You think it's the other way around?
I think that there is always first sense in the sense of orientation. We're always oriented, and even in the experience, the ultimate experience of disorientation, so the Unheimlichkeit, another sense is opened, a more profound sense. And I think that and this is one of the reasons why I would move this notion of the event towards what Gadamer, perhaps not fully in Gadamerian terms, what Gadamer calls Sinngeschehen. So there is an event is something that affects us, and because of that, it has and creates or gives some meaning to understand to us. So I always have a bit problem with the notion of nonsense. That's, I think.
But let me just ask you one last question. So if you look at birth, right, and finding yourself born and existing, do you find that to be sensed?
Well, it's very strange to well, I think when you're born, you're always oriented in a specific way. So there is in that sense no nonsense. And I think as soon as you start reasoning and discover that it is completely nonsensical that we are there, it becomes only more meaningful in a way. And so for me, there is I find the notion of nonsense very non. There is something too negative for me in this notion. Well, anyway, I'm completely sorry. As a chair, I should not take the whole discussion to me. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know whether.
I have 4 o'clock. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, there's one. I think we have one more time for one more
short
question.
thing.
One more question, and then we'll have a break.
Really short. Could it be that what Professor Heiden is talking about, and how I think it also probably, is that one approach starts out with the finitude of understanding, and the other starts up with the erupting event, and probably those are very symmetrical, or to some extent asymmetrical. Something like that. Is that a good idea or a way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, the finitude of the subject is receiving that event. So yes, I think they're connected. Yeah, for sure.
Professor Raffoul, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Raffoul once more for the talk and the discussions.
Thank you. And I'll see you in 30 minutes. I'll be at the Professor No talk.
I hope you will be there for the next talk.
Yes, I'm coming to the next talk.
Perfect, and we hope that you will join in for the discussion as well at that point. So now we will have a break for about 30 minutes, and then we continue at 4:30. See you in a while.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gert-Jan.